of wonders, your power has no end. Things you've done before in greater measure, you do again. 'Cause there's no prison, oh, you can't break through, no mountain you can't move, oh, things are possible. Yeah. 'Cause there's no broken body you can't raise, no song that you can't save, oh, things are possible. The darkest night, you can light it up, you can light it up, oh God of revival, let hope arise, death is overcome, you've already won, oh God of revival, God of revival, oh. You rose in victory, and now you're seated forever on your throne. Why? So why should my heart fear what you defeated? I will trust in your love. There's no prison, no you can't break through, no mountain you can't move, oh, things are possible. There's no broken body you can't raise, no soul that you can't save, oh, things are possible. The darkest night, you can light it up, you can light it up, oh God of revival, let hope arise, death is overcome, you've already won, oh God of revival. Jesus, so come awaken your people, come awaken the city, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Every stronghold will crumble, we hear the chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Come on! Come awaken your people, come awaken the city, God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Oh, every stronghold will crumble, we hear the chains hit the ground. God of revival, pour it out, pour it out. Come on, come awaken your people, come awaken the city. God of revival, pour it out, pour
Hey, church. So glad to have you with us. Hope you enjoyed that time in worship. We're going to get into a message in just a minute, so you have time to spread the word, let your friends know, hit the share button. If you're watching this afterwards, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us wherever you are joining us from. Thank you for being a part of these online services and community. And thank you for your partnership. Those of you that give and support this ministry, really, this is made possible by your generosity. And we are so thankful for those of you who link arms with us to help us get these messages out. We're seeing people's lives changed. We've seen so many people who have been impacted by what God's doing through this church and watching online, people who've given their lives to Jesus, people who've found faith again, or they've seen God do miracles in their life. It's amazing. And so thank you for your support. All that happens as a result of this is credit to your account as far as God is concerned if you are a partner with us in this ministry. So all the ways you can give and continue to support are on the screen. We really value that, and that is so necessary for us to continue to go forward, reach new people, and even do more that God has called us to do. So thank you for continuing to support. Wanted to let you know before we get into this message today that next week is Mother's Day. We'll have a special message here online for you moms, and I'm trying to get my wife to be a part of that, so maybe we can coax her into it. If you follow her on social media, maybe just give her a little nudge, say, hey, I'd love to see you on Mother's Day online. But no, we have a special message. It's going to be great. And if you are able to join us in person, many of you can't, but those who can, we're also going to have baptisms on Mother's Day right after the service, so we're really excited about that. If you'd like to be baptized, let us know, and we'll make sure to have everything that you'll need to be able to do that. It's going to be outside if the weather permits, inside if it doesn't. We'll be ready either way. But we'd love to have you join us and invite your moms as well. We're going to have some stuff for them, some ways to bless them for that special service, and you'll be able to take photos and stuff, and it'll be great. It's cool to see God growing our church, and those of you that help spread the word, we really appreciate that. We are looking for more and more people to be a part of this with us, so if you would like to be a part of the Cross and Anchor team, even if it's online through serving at our online services, we have people who faithfully each week help upload these messages, help moderate the chat, reach out to people who make commitments for Christ. We would love to help you get plugged in. So let us know by filling out that Connect card, and we would love to get you more information. Thanks so much for joining us today. Let's get into this message as we begin a brand new series this weekend. Hey, welcome this weekend. We are so glad to have you. My name is Josh, and I'm the lead pastor at Cross and Anchor, and we are starting a new series today on the book of Jonah. Jonah, maybe you're familiar with the story. It's a quirky little tale that is in the Old Testament of the Bible, and when you think of Jonah, you might think of a big fish and water and storms. I was looking through some different titles of series that other pastors and preachers have given to the book of Jonah, and there's a lot of cheese involved. A whale of a tale, a fishy tale about a faithful God. What's some other ones that I saw? A fish tale. It's just, it lends itself to puns and to humor because it's just a little quirky book in the Bible. And Jonah is an interesting guy because he's like a prophet, but he refuses to tell people God's message, which is kind of like you're doing exactly the opposite of what your job is supposed to be. You had one job, and Jonah runs away from God, and yet God still uses him. And it's a fun book that I'm excited to get into today. We've called our series on the book of Jonah, just simply Journey to Nineveh. It's going to be 4 parts. It'll start today. It'll go over 4 weeks, and I hope that you can join us for at least 3 out of these next 4 weeks, because I think God's really going to speak to you, and he has something that he wants to let you know from this book of the Bible. So let's open it up. Let's start in Jonah chapter 1, and we'll read the first few verses, and then we'll keep going today. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.' But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." I've called today's message, "When God says go, and you say no." Jonah was called to go to Nineveh. And you might wonder, why is he so hesitant about going to this place? Well, we're going to get to that in just a second. But to understand what he does do, you kind of need a little bit of ancient geography. So God said to go to Nineveh, which was a huge, big metropolitan city. It was like one of the great cities of the ancient world. In fact, people have said that the walls of Nineveh, you could have 3 chariots side by side, and that was about the width of these walls. They were thick and strong. It had a huge population, but it was also incredibly pagan and incredibly evil. They were known for some really atrocious things, such as child sacrifice and violence. There was also the king was viewed as a deity, and it was just this oppressive regime. And Jonah says, "I don't want to go to Nineveh." So Nineveh is basically in Iraq, modern day Iraq. Tarshish, where Jonah decides he's going to get on a boat and go to, is basically Spain. So he's going as far away as he possibly can from where God told him to go. Our first point is just this: what in Tarshish is going on here? What in Tarshish is going on here? Jonah's like, "I am not going to Nineveh." Why? Well, because of some of the things that I just described, it's very possible that Jonah was scared. I mean, what if God had told you, "I want you to pick up from where you're at, grab all your stuff. I want you to fly over to the Middle East and go to Iran and find all of the leaders of Iran, and I want you to preach the gospel to them"? That's a little bit of a scary proposition, considering Christianity in Iran is illegal, and you can literally be killed for believing in Christ. Jonah's task is something that we kind of don't really fully appreciate how hard it was that God was asking him to do this. Not to mention that the Ninevites were people that had tried to take out Israel at least 3 times that we read of in the Bible. So they aren't on the best of terms. So imagine that God goes to somebody in Ukraine and says, "Hey, I want you to go to Russia, go to the Kremlin, and I want you to preach the gospel to Vladimir Putin." They aren't exactly on the best of terms right now, right? They're on the brink of annihilation, and these people are their enemies. So Jonah might not have wanted to go for that reason as well, and we're going to see more of his reasoning as we go on in the book. But the question isn't just, why did Jonah say no? The question is also, why do we say no when God has us do something that is uncomfortable for us to do? Or when God tells us to go, why do we say no? Because if we're honest, I think there is Jonah inside of all of us. Jonah, it says 3 times in this short section here in chapter 1. It says 3 times that he flees from the presence of the Lord. How many times have you found yourself fleeing from the presence of the Lord, trying to run away from God because you know what he wants you to do and you don't want to do it? Our second point is just this: fleeing from the presence of the Lord is foolishness. It's foolishness. Because when you think about it, where are you going to go? God is everywhere. You can't really run away from him. The Bible is very clear that God is omnipresent, which means that he is all over the place. He is everywhere. And so there really isn't a place that you can run to that you're going to get away from God. The Psalms talk about this, where David says, even if I were to make my bed in hell, you'd be there. Like, there's nowhere that God is not. And so if you try to run away from God, you're not going to succeed in getting any further away from him. He's always going to be there. And as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, if you are one, you have a calling. Sure, you might not be a prophet, but you are a called Christian. God has an assignment and a purpose on your life. And you might try to run away from it and get away from it, but you can't. Wherever you go, God has placed this thing on you that he intends for you to do. And some of us, we kind of relegate God to a certain portion of our lives. And like Jonah, we're like, hey, we're good with this, but we're not good with this. So God, we're good with you loving us. Like, I'm fine, God, I love hearing the message about how much you love me, but I'm not okay with you telling me who I need to love. God, I'm fine with being blessed by you. Yes, bless me, God. Bless my work. Bless my job. Bless my finances. Bless my family. But I'm not okay with you telling me who I need to be a blessing to. Like, we're okay if God calls us to California, but we might not be okay if he calls us to Cairo. We have limits oftentimes on what we will allow God to tell us to do. And so Jonah says, God, I'm okay with you having some of me, but I'm not okay with you having all of me. And we have to get to a place as followers of Jesus where our whole life is open to whatever God would tell us to do. But if you do decide to run away from God, I want you to know that there's always a boat that's willing to take you. Did you see how in verses 2 and 3, it says that Jonah went down to Joppa and he found a ship going to Tarshish? When you decide, I'm going to run away from God, there will always be provision that will pop up. Sometimes it seems like miraculously for you to be able to do it. And I want you to know today that just because something presents itself to you does not mean that it is from God. Like, if you're like, hey, I'm going to run away from God, I'm going to go do the exact opposite of what he's called me to do. It doesn't even necessarily have to be geographically. It can be spiritually. You know God has said to do something or to not do something, and you've decided to go and run the opposite direction. And then all of a sudden you find that whatever it is that you're trying to do, there's a means and a provision to do it. And I know so many Christians who then will say, well, God must be okay with it. Because here's what I wanted to do, and now there's a way to do it. Just as an example, I needed a job. And then all of a sudden, this job came up out of nowhere. And yes, it does mean that I have to compromise my integrity, but the paycheck is amazing. Or I've been looking to date somebody. I'm so lonely. I'm so tired of being single. And I was on this dating app, and this guy started messaging me. And yes, he's not a Christian, but there's an opportunity and a means to no longer be lonely. I'm sure God is fine with it. Or money was tight, and I needed a roommate, and I couldn't find one, but my girlfriend was willing to move in with me. And so now I can save on rent. God provides. Listen, God is a provider when you follow what he says to do. But the devil is also looking to provide for you an alternative to what God wants you to do. And so don't be a foolish Christian who says, just because there is something that looks like it can solve my problems, that it is from God. And you have to know, so you can discern what is from God and what isn't, is how did Jonah know that this ship wasn't from God? Because in order to get on the ship and go to Tarshish, he had to directly contradict the word of the Lord. If there is something that God says in his word, he's not going to contradict it to accommodate your circumstance. If it contradicts the word of the Lord, then it is not God's provision for you, however much it might seem like that. God is never going to contradict what he says in order to accommodate your situation. So how do you know if it's not from God? If it contradicts the word of the Lord, then it's not from God. So many couples like, oh, we just can't get along. We just keep fighting. We're just at each other's throats. Maybe it's okay for us to get a divorce. Listen, unless God has said in his word, there's very few exceptions in his word for divorce. Unless God said it, then it's not from him. There will always be a boat that will take you where you want to go, but just because it's there doesn't mean that God provided it. And here is the truth, and here's what I've seen in my life, is that when you surrender to God and when you do what he says, even as hard as it is in the moment, it's always the best possible thing to do. We run from God, but it ends up in a place that is not very good. Look at what happens to Jonah as he continues to run. Verse 4, but the Lord, so Jonah's like, but, God says go, and he says, but, and then as he goes, but, then God goes, but, there's like these countermeasures back and forth. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, what do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. Have you ever been in an intense storm? I've never been in a storm on the sea or in a boat. That actually seems very, very scary. Maybe some of you have had an experience like that. But I have been in some pretty intense turbulence inside of planes before. And as the plane is kind of bouncing around and you drop suddenly and you kind of feel your stomach going up into your chest, it is not a good feeling. And you know it's bad when the flight attendants are told to take a seat. Like if the flight attendants are still moving around and somehow maneuvering down the aisle and keeping their balance while they're going and getting your drinks or whatever, then everything is probably okay. But when they have to sit down and put their seatbelts on and they're afraid, that's when I would get afraid. And look at verse 5, the mariners, the sailors, the ones who are professional people of the sea and water, they're freaking out. That's how bad of a storm this is that they are losing their minds and they think that they are going to die. And so where do they go? They go to Jonah, who is the follower of God. And what I've seen a lot of times in life is that in crisis, everyone's a Christian. In crisis, everyone's a Christian, or at least religious or spiritual. It's been said that there are no atheists in foxholes. Like when you get into a super intense situation and you think that your life is on the line, all of a sudden you're like calling out to whatever God it is that you can think of, and you're looking for the person that might be a representative of God. I can't tell you how many people will come to me as a pastor and want me to pray for them when the bottom falls out. And it's my joy and privilege to be able to pray for them in those situations. But there's an even better way to live life, and that is to not be like the sailors who only call out to God when there's a difficulty. But be the person who has a relationship with God. just to kind of juxtapose these sailors in this situation and followers of Jesus, John Wesley, the great revivalist, the reason that he became a follower of Jesus is because he was on a ship going back and forth from England to America quite a bit. And he was actually a preacher. He was a religious person, but he didn't actually know Jesus. And while he was on a ship one of these times during one of his travels, there was this horrible storm that hit the boat. And there were on the boat lots of Moravians who were just kind of this sect of followers of Christ. And the way that they handled themselves, they were just so calm. And they were so at ease in a perilous circumstance. Everybody else was freaking out, but the Moravians were just like, they were chill. And it was this testament to their faith in God that's what actually opened John Wesley's eyes to realize that he didn't have that same faith and that same trust. And he was realizing that he needed to give his life to Jesus. You see, don't be like the sailors who have to cry out when there's a storm. Be somebody who you follow Jesus so closely that you know he's with you in the storm. And so you don't have to freak out. So Jonah, where is Jonah while all this is going on? Apparently, he's asleep. And this isn't a sleep like if you're familiar in the New Testament where Jesus, there's a storm and he's asleep on the boat. This is not like that. Jesus is asleep because Jesus was calm. Jesus was in control. Jesus was the king of the storm. Jonah is sleeping because we don't know why exactly. But I would venture to guess a couple of things. One is that he definitely shouldn't have been asleep, right? We know that he's asleep in a time when he should have been awake. People are panicking all around him. The boat's moving up and down. Everybody thinks they're going to die. And Jonah is asleep, which I think is just kind of a picture of his spiritual state at this point. Jonah is not in connection with God in a way that he has the ability to have this conversation with him about the circumstances around him, in a way that he's able to help those that are in the middle of a crisis. He's asleep spiritually as well as physically. And I believe that possibly Jonah is asleep maybe because he's running from God and he's trying to avoid and pretend like the situation around him isn't happening. Do you ever get like that? Like when you know that you're not in the right place or doing the right thing, and then something happens and you just kind of like try to distance yourself from it and pretend like it's not actually going down. Jonah is removed from the situation when he should have been involved in the situation. And Jonah is not in a good spiritual state, so it's even likely that Jonah is somewhat depressed at this point. Did you know that one of the telltale signs of depression is sleeping too long? People who are depressed tend to have a tendency to oversleep because it's a coping mechanism. It's a way to not have to think about the things that they're dealing with. And I believe that Jonah at this point in his life is depressed, and his depression is a result of his disobedience. Not all depression is the result of disobedience, but Jonah's, I believe, is, because he's on the run from God. And the Bible talks about that kind of thing where, like even King David in the Psalms, after he had an affair with Bathsheba and he had covered it up and hid it, he said in Psalm 32:3, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long." Like there was this sense in which he knew he had grieved God and he hadn't dealt with it. And so he's carrying the weight of the shame and the guilt of this, and it's weighing him down and making him depressed. So Jonah is sleeping through the storm. He's trying to numb the pain. And how often do we do that? Sometimes as the result of our disobedience. And the numbing doesn't work, does it? It doesn't make the problem go away. It's still there. It might not be sleeping, but it could be even things like opioid addiction or overusing alcohol, or even something like watching way too much Netflix or overeating and binging on stuff that's not healthy. And it's just like these coping mechanisms that we have that we think are going to help us, but they actually end up hurting us and making our problems even worse. So a couple of more points. This is one of the last ones. Listen, when you disobey God, you'll pay. When you disobey, you'll pay. You pay a price for your disobedience. Did you see in the first couple of verses how Jonah paid the fare to get onto the boat? And then it says he went down to Joppa. Then when he got on the boat, he went down into the bottom of the boat. And then he went down to sleep. Every time you make a step to try to avoid or go against what God has told you to do, you're taking a step down. You're not taking a step up. Whenever you make a choice to obey God in faith, you take a move up. But whenever you decide, I'm not going to obey God, I'm not going to believe what he said, you take a step down. And it's a downgrade as well. It doesn't make your life better, it makes your life worse. And your disobedience doesn't just affect you. Did you see what's happening all around Jonah? There's this massive storm. These other people's lives are in jeopardy. They're freaking out. We like to think that when we choose to go against what God said, it's just between us and him and it doesn't really affect anybody else. But it does. It affects everybody else in your life. Even if they're not in a storm with you as a result of your disobedience, they're feeling the effects of it. And there's people that God's called you to minister to, that God's called you to love and to serve and be a light to. And when you're walking in disobedience, you're preventing yourself from being used by God in their lives. And so there's always a price to pay for our disobedience. But like I said before, when you choose to obey, God blesses that. God takes you up from there. There's a couple in our church. We're in the middle of a giving campaign trying to get into a new location for our church. And we announced a few weeks ago that we're trying to raise funds, and there was a big initial response. And someone from our church, a couple from our church, they heard what we were trying to raise, and they felt like God told them that they were supposed to give 10% of that total amount, which was a lot of funds. And they called me and they were like, hey, we just feel like God's telling us that this is the number that we need to give. And when they told me that, I was so blown away because I knew that had to have been God, because I knew that would be a stretch. And I knew that it didn't, maybe make the most logical sense. It was just a step of faith they felt like that God had told them to do. And then they told me a couple weeks later, after they made that initial pledge, and they made their first, gift toward that, they told me that they were looking at their accounts and their savings and their retirement, and like every day it was just like going up and going up and going up. Listen, when you obey God, as hard as it is, as stretching as it is, he blesses that. Imagine if that couple had heard God tell them that, but they said, no. I think in the long run, they would have been less better off than they were by obeying what God said to do. So if you are asleep today, if you're like Jonah trying to cope with the problems that are in your life as a result of disobedience through just numbing it or trying to avoid it, I think the word of God for you today would be what he says in Ephesians 5:14. Awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Listen, God is saying to you today, awake from your slumber, awake from your apathy, awake from your disobedience, awake from running away from God. Open your eyes, stand up, quit laying down, and start walking into everything that God has for you. And Christ will shine on you. All you have to do is start taking steps forward, and God is going to bring his presence into your situation, and he can change whatever needs to be changed. He can meet you where you're at. Even if there's some serious consequences from the result of your disobedience, God can be gracious and redeem them. So he's saying, awake. Look what happens at the end of this chapter. Jonah chapter 1, verse 7. Let's keep reading. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? And where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" Uh-oh. And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid. They said, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. There it is again. Because he had told them. Isn't it crazy when you get called out from non-believers, non-Christians on your behavior? They're like, "You should know better." And you're like, "You're right. I can't argue with you on that." Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land. They're still trying to get out of it, but they could not. For the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him to the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. When they relented to what God wanted, and when Jonah relented to what God wanted, the crazy storm abated, and it went back to normal. And then it says in verse 17, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Now, there's a lot of people who question the veracity of this text because getting swallowed up by a big fish and living for 3 days is a very unlikely scenario, we'll put it like that. Did this actually happen? Or is it just some kind of tale, metaphor for what happens when we disobey God? Well, a few things. One is there's actually a person recently, you can read about this, who was swallowed inside of a fish, of a whale, and lived to tell the tale. I just read this in the news not too long ago. And this person lived, came out the other side, and was okay. So could this have happened? I think, yes, it definitely could have happened. And I believe it did happen, but don't get so caught up on how, what kind of whale? What kind of fish? Where was, exactly the sea? How did he survive? Which all those things could have happened, but don't just get caught up on did it happen, but think about the fact that it does still happen. This is a story that we can all relate to in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not all the details of the storm and the sea and the fish, but all of the things that we know how they relate in our lives. And the fact that it is a very unlikely scenario is actually exactly the point. God provided a miracle for Jonah to be able to survive and live. That's the point. Listen, you might feel like you're in a situation that you could never get out of. Maybe the consequences of your decisions have put you in the middle of a storm. Maybe it's like a financial storm. And you're like, there is no way that I could ever recover from this. There's no way that my business could ever recover from this. There's no way that my family could ever recover from this. Listen, I believe as you submit and surrender to God, that He can provide a fish for you. He can do things that you don't think are possible. He can do things that will blow your mind, provisions that will come out of nowhere. And He's just waiting on you to surrender to Him. And if you would say, okay, God, I'm done running, I'm done doing my own thing, I'm willing to relent and obey, God can do the miraculous. The last point I want to make here is just this, is that Jesus uses Jonah to talk about himself. Jesus uses Jonah to talk about himself. We look at this story and we think of how big of a mistake it was for Jonah to run away from God and his own just kind of hard heart and stubbornness. But really, the bigger story over the book of Jonah is not about how Jonah was such a runaway prophet. It's about how God is such a faithful God. Like, even though Jonah ran away, even though he disobeyed God and his professional occupation was to be a spiritual overseer, if you will, even though he did all these things, God still relentlessly pursued him and chased him down and got to him and got him to a place where he was willing to say yes. That's the great news of the book of Jonah, is that God is a gracious God. It doesn't matter how dumb you are. It doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made. It doesn't matter how much you've said no to God. God is relentlessly pursuing after you, and he won't stop. Maybe some of you have been just running from God for so long, and you keep on doing the things that he tells you not to do. And you know, and you feel it on the inside, and your soul is even kind of in turmoil because you're living this double life where you have too much of Jesus in you to really be satisfied in the world, but you have too much of the world in you to really be satisfied in Jesus, and you're so living this tormented existence. And it's because God is chasing after you, and he will not let you get away. He runs you down. He gives you forgiveness. He gives you grace. He takes you back. And as we continue through the book of Jonah, you'll see that God even uses Jonah still. But I said that Jesus uses Jonah to talk about himself. Look at Matthew chapter 12, verse 40. It says, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." If you wonder if God can use your mistakes, look no further than Jonah. Because here's Jonah running from God, doing what he's not supposed to be doing, relentlessly fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And yet, God redeems his story so much so that Jesus actually uses him to point to what it's going to mean for him to die and raise again. Like, the details of Jonah's story were actually a foretelling of what would happen when Jesus went into the heart of the earth and then rose from the grave 3 days, and then he resurrected again. This is God's hand, even in Jonah's mistakes. So God can redeem your past. God can use it and even take your mess and turn it into a message for other people. And Jesus uses this picture, and I think it's intentional because it's also symbolic of Jesus' not just his death and resurrection, but of our own death and resurrection, if you will. That's why we get baptized. Because we go into the water, and when we go into the water, it's like we're dying. We're dying to our old self. We're dying to our old ways. We're dying to who we used to be. And then when we come up out of that water, just like in a couple of chapters, Jonah's going to come out of the belly of that whale. We come out resurrected to new life. And so if you're Jonah today, you can have grace. You can be forgiven. You can be redeemed. Because God is relentlessly pursuing you, because he is just insanely in love with you. Can we pray? God, thank you for your grace in our worst mistakes. Thank you for this story that gives us so much encouragement and hope, because we can all see ourselves in Jonah. I just pray for anyone today who has yet to give their lives to you, that they would know that they're not too far from you, they're not too removed from you, that you love them enough that you gave your son for them and you're willing to come in their lives and change them, and you're actually right next to them if they would just open their eyes to see it. And today, God, if there's anybody who's watching who needs to either surrender their lives to you or kind of come back to you after running from you for a long time, I pray that today would be that marker of a new beginning for them. If you would like to do that, whether you want to give your life to Christ for the first time or you want to return to him after running away from him, what I want you to do in the chat in just a moment is I want you to signify that by just putting up your hand or typing, "This is me." And we just want to pray for you. There's no embarrassment here. Like, there's no shame in this. This is actually something that we celebrate when people make these commitments. And I just want to give you a chance, an opportunity to do that today. And I do want you to do this because it's not like there's anything magical about this, but I think it's important to have a moment where we're called out and we make a decision. We say, "I'm going to follow Jesus." And this can be that for you, a symbol of this beginning of a new journey with him. So if you would like to give your life to Jesus today or return to him after running from him, I just want you to do that in the chat as we are talking right now. Listen, God loves you. He sees that. He sees your heart as you make this commitment, and he's willing to give you grace, and he's willing to let you start again. Awesome. Can we just celebrate with those? Maybe you're watching online. Let's encourage those people who are making that decision. Let's clap for them. Let's, whatever we can do emoji-wise to show our support. If that's you today, listen, there's going to be a link that pops up right now. I'd love for you to fill out this Connect card so that we can just continue to pray for you. And we'd also love to send you a free Bible if you'd like. We've sent those all over the place, and it's so cool to see people giving their lives to Christ and starting a fresh journey with him. We'd even love to help you get plugged into a church. Maybe you don't live in Detroit, you live somewhere else. We'd love to help you find a good church that you can get plugged into. So let's celebrate with those who are making this commitment today. Listen, we'll be back next week as we continue the book of Jonah, this series, Journey to Nineveh. Can't wait to see you then. We love you. Have a great week.